Welcome to Master Your Merger, the podcast for leaders navigating the people side of mergers and acquisitions. Each week, your host Klint talks with deal makers, HR leaders, and integration experts to uncover what really works when it comes to people, culture, and performance during a deal. From retaining top talent to aligning leadership, you'll hear real stories and actionable insights from the people doing the work, all designed to help you make your merger work. If you're leading through M&A, this is your weekly playbook.
Welcome to the Master Your Merger podcast. Today I'm joined by Simone Vascotto, founder of Humanaq. Simone has spent a lot of time studying how organizational behavior shifts during M&A. He spent a lot of time thinking about what early cultural signals can show us about alignment, leadership cohesion, and integration risk. What I appreciate about Simone's approach is how he defines culture, not as corporate slogans or superficial survey results, but as the everyday behaviors and patterns that reveal how people actually work, collaborate, and respond to change. In our conversation today, we'll explore what those behavioral signals really mean, why many leaders overlook them, and how they should inform the people side of integration, especially in the early diligence phase. Simone, welcome to Master Your Merger.
Thank you, Klint. It's a pleasure. I've been looking at your other episodes, so I'm very excited to be here. It's my first ever podcast, so this makes it even more exciting. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, thrilled to do it, and I'm glad that we'll get you an opportunity here because I think you've got some great things to share. Well, so Simone, before we dive in, give us a sense of your background and what led you to study organizational behavior through the lens of culture signals in M&A.
Absolutely. So I'll give you a background as to who I am, and you have so you know where this is coming from. My background is engineering, so that's where my foundation is from, and the only foot in M&A was through a family succession, really. So that's where I had started a marketplace for small cap successions at the very beginning. Given the fact that I had seen a succession on as a young boy to facilitate that. That marketplace then turned into the current company, which revolves all around culture, right? Why did that big pivot happen? And mainly because when I was building the marketplace, which revolved around creating profiles with soft factors, the buy side would not be so interested, right, in filling in this data. And the matchmaking wasn't so much the problem that was being faced. Rather than I took a step back and realized after months and months of research with the M&A network I had gathered that culture is, right? How integrations and how organizations can really make an integration work, right? I also believe that every acquisition is a merger. Now, whether you follow that or not, that's something that I follow, right? Simply because when that happens, you need to create a new culture some way or somehow. I think there's maybe a misconception or just a belief that the acquiring company's culture has to become the dominant one. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe there's exactly what I try to do is showcase what works in either side and what could come out and flourish, right? And to just add to that is, why I'm fascinated about this is I'm from Italy. From the north of Italy, from Trieste, next to Venice. So that's the northeast. And the family succession was a pizzeria, right? So my grandpa was the entrepreneur of the family, and he really created this empire with pizza in the 40s and 50s. And even at that time, you can imagine pizza was new to us. Even for us, it was new at one point. And so with that, he created really this part of the city because that's what it had become. And the succession was outside the family because of the long hours and work. And I saw something dissipate, right? Even though it was economically successful for my grandfather, the culture, everything kind of really shifted and changed with the new management in just a matter of a year, right?
Right.
And so something that was so hard to what had been built over the years just dissipated. And so that really pushed me to learn more. And here we are in the rabbit hole down on culture.
Yeah. Well, it's a fantastic story. I mean, you've lived it, you've seen it. I once heard somebody say that culture is the shadow cast by leadership. And so it makes a ton of sense that out of looking at leaders and their behaviors and how they drive those ways of working, that culture seems to me to be a very logical place to go next.
It is logical. It's also funny you say that because I was just reading today, a LinkedIn post, and culture is very hard to not just quantify, but it tends to be uh, it's not, because it's hard to quantify. You don't know how to approach it. There's
Right.
no easy definitions, and so we use metaphors just like you have. And so that's a great one as well. I'm sure there's many more, but that's what I've done. And now we've partnered with I'm based in Spain, but we've partnered with a US based company to try and quantify culture looking at behavior. So that's the introduction. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk a little bit about that. So I know that the firm that you've partnered with, you have access to quite literally thousands of behavioral data points across different organizations. So when you look at all of the information that you have access to through that, what are some of the patterns that you're consistently seeing in these deals?
Yeah. Um, Absolutely. So I was lucky enough to be able to partner with this company. We now have access to 4.5 around million data points, right? And to get to your question, it's really about number one is uncertainty, right? What that means is people delaying decisions and waiting for directions,
Right.
right? So I must say that what I've seen is that culture is always top down, and so this is a primary thing that occurs. Uh, that's a delay, a time delay, and uncertainty causes this. One thing that I have also seen is with management. Now, management, funny enough, has to manage two different things. Continue running the business, especially, middle management, continue running the business while at the same time having to manage the acquisition and the integration. And so that can become a bottleneck in itself because, well, during that process, things are going to change, such as communication. You're going to have more internal communication. I'm sure this might come up again earlier, but so these shifts, then that might become a bottleneck in itself. Um, I think a really important one, which directly touches what culture is interpretation.
Say more about that.
Yeah, because culture is directly tied to how someone interprets something, right? Culture, obviously, you have organizational culture, which is affected by national culture, right? But people interpret things differently, right? So what really happens is when you have a specific way of doing things and set a specific set of behaviors that now has to coincide or match this other organization way of doing things that have been ingrained, right? All of a sudden you have this manager who tells you something and you might interpret it completely differently, right? So that's something that we see. And the last one, which is also very interesting, that I just want to highlight, is usually you get two groups that get formed, um, you know during these integrations, during acquisitions. It's almost like a natural behavior from humans and from people, and that is one that accepts it, that
Mhm.
accepts this transition, and so they are excited about what's next. They are willing to build this new company. Right. It's almost like, for me, I see it as almost like a software update that's new, and you're excited, and you know it just looks great. On the other hand, you have some of the workforce that's been in the company for years, and then they have the know-how, but they act a little bit as a slightly lifted handbrake,
Yeah.
simply because they pull back a little bit. They want to retain that information. And so that's a kind of, a high level overview of the main points that we see when looking at the data over time.
Makes a ton of sense. One of the things that you talked about with interpretation is really resonating with me. One of the ways that I see a lot of companies approach culture is they'll try to line up the two value statements of the companies,
Mm,
right? And they'll say that our value statements are alike, and therefore our cultures are the same. And for that, I often use the example that I see in a lot of startups. One of the cultural values is something like have fun. And
mm,
when I think about how that plays out in human beings, I've shared this a lot. My idea of having fun is getting on a roller coaster and then riding it until I am dizzy, right?
yeah.
My little brother, his idea of having fun is strapping 50 pounds of gear onto his back and walking off into the woods. That sounds like torture to me, right? You only do that to me if you're punishing me. That does not sound like fun. But my brother absolutely loves doing that. And similarly, you're not going to get him on a roller coaster. And so this idea that it really is the values, it just doesn't hold water with me. It's really about the behaviors. And everything that I've heard you talk about are really those observable behaviors. So let's talk behaviors for a minute. What kinds of behaviors reveal an organization's true cultural blueprint, especially during a transaction?
Yeah. Yeah, fantastic. So I think you already touched a point that I just want to take a step back and highlight as well. And you know, now that I've been down the rabbit hole of culture, it's important to highlight what it is a little bit. And I like to just segment it two different ways. One is exactly the values that you communicate. It's the strategies, it's the images. I
Yeah.
think that can be a medium with which you then communicate what culture is, but it's not the end goal. That's not what it is, right? Rather, it's the invisible. It's invisible, right? So that one's visible, this one is invisible, and it's what's written between the lines, right? It's the behavior, the unconscious behavior within the organization, within a team, or multiple teams that make up the organization. And mind you, each team can have its own unique approach, simply because maybe a different set of skills is required within that team, in that space, in that organ of the company. And so that's the way we look at it. Now, culture becomes a value driver because operational value creation depends on aligned behaviors, and that's when we come to behaviors, right? At the end of the day, every M&A player depends on people, and people
Yeah.
have their own set of behaviors. So what do we see? It's We look at where decisions get made, for instance. Now, quite literally, where that means in an office, or side conversations.
Mhm.
That that already changes a lot. It gives a lot of context. Um, how do people disagree? Right? Do they talk back? Do they push back? Do they mention? Do they speak honestly? Do they avoid conflict? Right? Or do they send an email and slow things down? For instance. Also, it's what happens when something goes wrong. Right? Um, Again, these are all sets of behaviors that are ingrained within people, but also their organization, and also how what people are told by top down what to do. So it's do people own the problem, or do they try and get rid of it, hide it, or put it on someone else? These are all things that stack up over time, and demonstrate how an organization moves, and with our data, we are able to understand these patterns and understand how people talk about priorities and ownership, right? So those are two key elements that we're able to look at this.
Fantastic. When I took a look at sort of behind the hood, when you were sharing with me the work that you do, I saw a lot of the research that we'd done around the five key drivers of culture clash reflected there. And
Mhm.
they're all really great ways of bucketing these behaviors into categories that make it easy for us to try and quantify what culture looks like. So everything that you're talking about just really resonates. It's that decision making. It's how does the team collaborate? It's how do we communicate? So I know that you've got a tool where you start to dig into these things during the diligence process. And I know that that's really an area that a lot of firms are exploring right now is how do we do this cultural due diligence? So what I'd love to hear is a story about where some of those early signals that you picked up during diligence predicted a cultural or a leadership challenge before it hit the surface.
So, a deal that I can give as an example, is where two companies truly believed that they had similar culture. Just like you mentioned, Klint, they shared values, the similar values, right? To what extent is that true? We were not sure, but they said they were both highly collaborative and customer centric, right? So on paper, they were quite happy. When we stepped in, we when we ran this analysis, it showed a different result. So that means that one company, took initiative with customers, and they went out of their way, um, and bent, a few rules to then resolve that problem for the customer. On the other hand, the company who said would be, customer centric or focused, would first follow the rules, right? The processes, and then approach the customer, and resolve the problem. So that's a key difference that we saw. And the approach is, if someone says, I see a problem, I fix it, and the other one is more like, I see a problem, maybe I escalate it, or I just push it later, and then we look at the customer. So
Right.
that's something that we've seen.
Yeah, well, and that's a really good point that you bring up. I do believe that most leaders do their best to establish a culture that works for them. I do think the larger the organization gets, the harder it is for leaders to really understand what's going on uh, deeper inside the organization. So I think about that show Undercover Boss, for example.
Hmm.
Where
Okay.
the boss goes to find out what's really happening deeper inside their organization, and the number of them that are legitimately surprised by how the employees treat each other or how they treat customers, and they're like, "This isn't the culture that I wanted." So I think that that show is a really great example of the disconnect that can sometimes exist between leaders and their organizations and perhaps why during diligence it makes sense to get an independent view to the extent that you can of the cultures, or at the very least, you're probably not going to kill the deal over some of these cultural differences, right? But you can at least think about how you're going to mitigate them as you do your integration and you bring the organizations together.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, absolutely. To an extent, it doesn't have to throw away the whole deal thesis. On the other hand, what we have seen in some cases is that with some cultures, running a culture due diligence, they say, doesn't show trust. You know, to what extent do you believe that to be true or not? I
Sure.
don't know. But perhaps to us, the way we look at it is maybe that's a red flag in itself if you don't want to, run that.
Oh, I agree. Look, nobody says to the CFO, You didn't give me audited financials, therefore there's no trust," right? We expect audited financials to come through. We expect quality of earnings to look a certain way. So I agree with you that, there's there are certain areas where I completely understand that the valuation and the purchase price are going to rise and fall on the financials, but the integration and the actual value creation is going to happen almost always around the people.
Correct. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that I've been talking about for a bit, and you and I have chatted about quite a bit, is this idea of integration debt. And I define that as those hidden costs that come when we delay decisions or have misalignment during an integration. So from your perspective, with all of this behavioral data that you have, what are some of the patterns that reveal misalignment early, misalignment that could destroy value?
Absolutely. It is indeed a topic that we've mentioned before, and my team and I use it quite some time. It's also a good term, integration debt, to really communicate what truly happens if you don't understand culture, right?
Mhm.
If it's not acted upon, because it's silent, right? And similarly to what you said, it's the hidden cost that builds over time.
Yeah.
With if you don't, consider the people problem, right? And mainly decision and clarity, which, those are the two pillars that we look at. And to answer your question, some early warning signs can be like leader saying the strategy but running a different one, right? So they say it with their words, but behind the scenes they do something completely different. Um, Another one is, I believe we mentioned it earlier, it's teams starting to duplicate their work because they're not sure who owns what is the combined company, who has to do what. So there's a bit of uncertainty just like before, and no one really wants to own up to it, right? So these are all things that tend to happen. Another one, for instance, is projects that tend to not finish, or
Yeah.
get initiated and they don't call a stop to it, and they just get parked, for instance, right? And so then no one again here wants to say yes or no, right? So these are just some things um, that we see, and mind you, all of these slow down a process in just workflows. So they have very important economic effects.
Right. Well, so let's look on the flip side. So those are some of the warning signs. What are some of the signals that tell you alignment is strong and that they're likely to avoid accumulating that integration debt?
Right. Yeah. So I mean, when you look at the data that we have, we're able to understand, the patterns and priorities and ownership at the different management levels, right? So if you look at what tends to work is when management has a clear-cut story.
Mhm.
They know what to say, and they just say, "This is what matters now. This is what we'll focus on. This is what we can just postpone, and that's what can wait," right? So that's a big one. Another one is when there's a shared logic, right? A shared way of thinking. So what that means is everyone's on the same page as to we're focusing on X and we're doing Y later because whatever reason, right? Um, so the decision making is clear. Okay. Also, people know who decides, who is consulted, and who needs to be informed. These are all things that enforce and help the whole transition. um the best part, and when you truly know you've hit the nail on the head, is when the teams naturally start to talk to each other, right?
Yes.
So you have cross company teams that form. And what could be really beneficial here is if they're formed on their skill sets and what they're good at, then based on that they could try to reach out, and that really um, comes out. So as I said, we're able to see this with the data. um, what you do still see is conflict, that you can't completely erase conflict. On the other hand, it's the the conflict is different. It's pointed at solving the same problem rather than looking at yeah, and defending old agendas, right? So that's what the main difference is.
Yeah. No, it's fantastic. So I've been thinking a lot about AI lately, and I know that you've got some AI horsepower underneath the product you're working with. As AI becomes more capable of analyzing behaviors at scale, what are some of the micro patterns that it can surface that we humans tend to miss, and especially as it relates to the alignment or fragmentation we've been talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think AI is in everyone's mind. It's always at the topic. We don't go out to say we are so AI centric, but we do use it, right? And that's the whole core concept of why I'm doing what I'm doing, and that is to try and make give data to culture, this very intangible pillar. I think it could be interesting to just highlight how we do it, maybe to give some context.
Sure.
And I don't come from data science, so I'll give you very surface level understanding that I think that's enough for now.
Yeah.
And that is simply that. So firstly, in M&A, the way I've seen AI being used is in diligence, which is, this case, for instance,
Mhm.
and in documentation. So making, the processes a bit faster. Um, what in our case we use is a cognitive NLP. So that's a natural language processing model. Without sounding super complex, all it does is that it looks at patterns and it turns words into data. And the cognitive part is that it tries to mirror human cognition, so it looks at this, tone, the context, the frequency, and determines the behaviors and patterns, right? That's what it is. And it comes from a handful of open-ended questions. For instance, it even understands slang, right? And that's the whole point. What's interesting here, to come back to the question, is that the industry standard for now, if I may say, is a gut feeling.
Right. Right.
Right. So, and I actually admire this because it exists, and absolutely, I'm not saying we replace it, or we have the go to. What I'm saying is perhaps this gut feeling can be enhanced with data as well. And what I mean by gut feeling and why I admire it is because when I've spoken with professionals who've done multiple deals, they truly have almost a sixth sense, right, as to what they can tell is happening, how it's moving, and so they say culture usually is just a gut feeling, and that's what we go with. Or there's a series of other ways to do it, but that's one. Um, what we do is, and why it's so important, is that in reality, a manager can't read a room. You can understand one or two people. You can read one or two people, but you can't read hundreds of people, the whole organization, right? And so that's what we try and map out, right? We map out how leaders are aligned. They may say they're aligned, but are they truly aligned, right? To what extent are they aligned? On what grounds, right? And sometimes also teams underplay a risk or overstate certainty. So those are all things that we see occur, and with in regards to what your question to your question, Clint.
Yeah, the going back to the gut feel. Look, I actually do think there's a place for it, right? You've done
Hmm.
something for a long time, you begin to see those patterns, and we know a lot from neuroscience that part of gut feel is actually picking up those micro patterns, but it's in the background, and a lot of times gut feel begins with a statement like, "Well, I can't quite put my finger on why."
Hmm.
Right? I don't know why, but I feel this way. And there's a reason that we as a species have come to rely on it, and that's because it is fairly reliable. But to your point, it is fairly reliable, usually in smaller settings or smaller situations that
Hmm.
have to do with our individual survival, which is really where that's finely attuned. And without going too far down my PhD neuroscience rabbit hole,
Sure, sure.
it's just not a great tool for doing diligence at scale. A lot of times, what it is you get a group of deal makers together, and they've gone out to lunch with the same group of people a bunch of times, and that gut feel suddenly becomes: Do I like you as a leader, and do I think you as a leader can help us deliver the deal thesis? And I think that's really important, right? I think it's really important that your leadership team be able to get along, and yet that gut feel has not managed to break through the failure rate that we see with M&A. We still have this massive rate where 8 out of 10, 7 out of 10 deals do not meet their financial thesis.
Hmm.
And so, yes, please do keep the gut feel, but as we have more refined tools available, I think we need to use them. And with that, I'll get off my soapbox.
No, absolutely. If I just may add a sentence to it,
Yeah,
uh, these professionals, using gut feeling is it, this doesn't remove it. It only enhances it, as I said earlier. If anything, you have more leverage to then, mm, you know, have decisions to then derive the gut feeling from, right? Additional
right.
decisions. That's what it is. It's just another medium with which you can use.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, let's talk a little bit more here. You've studied how people collaborate, how they make decisions, how they communicate. Those are some of the key elements that you look at. Which of those behaviors are the strongest predictors that an integration is going to maintain momentum versus stalling?
Sure. I mean, so if we look at the momentum, right, specifically, it comes down to how leaders simplify the message. As I mentioned it earlier, right? So that's how direct the message was, for instance, right? How
Right.
clear cut it was. And especially they tend to repeat the message until they know that the other person has understood it, right? They can say it back. Also, it comes down to teams asking for clarity, that's how you know you have momentum. They're proactive. They come to you with a question. They want clarity. They want more information. Okay. Um, there is no guessing and hoping. There's no, this, you feeling in the middle of something. It's ambiguous. It's clear cut. That's how you know momentum is happening. On the other side, there's more, more of a situation of a stall when decisions tend to be revisited, right? It takes longer, more cycles. It's yeah, more, the decision making is just not as fast. No one fully commits, as I said earlier. It's harder to commit. People don't want to, they want to be on the correct side, and so it's also about agreeing in the meeting, but then, as I said, using your old playbook. Uh, and then it becomes to, this is something I like to say, it's updating, updates become status rather than decision making. I think that's quite interesting because, you try to say that, but it's a status. It doesn't really happen. Nothing really concrete comes out of it. Right. So if from the data that we look at is that we're able to really talk about self-protection and less about trade-offs and accountability. So if to come to the conclusion, those are the aspects that we're able to look at to derive, what's really happening.
So, Simone, as we wrap up, I think you've done a really great job of talking about a lot of the upside of doing this kind of work. As I think about some of the concerns I've heard from leaders about doing cultural diligence at this level, a couple of things come up. One, there's really limited access to employees during the diligence period. So sometimes they worry about the validity of it. And then sometimes it can seem intrusive if you do find a way to talk to everybody. So, what are some of the things that you've heard around that, and how do you overcome those concerns?
Yeah, those are great points, and thankfully, the new approach is, the one we use at least is less invasive, right? Interviews use are very invasive. If someone feels attacked, why am I being questioned by a third party, for instance? Um, and surveys, everyone kind of has seen them already, and they turn to measure more emotion rather than behavior. But to come to your question, it really comes down to the whole organization, right? So we are able to speed up the process from 3 months to around 7 to 10 days, and with that, then it's not so much about becoming intrusive and analyzing, scrutinizing every individual within the company, but rather communicating that this analysis is quite holistic, simply to derive, how things are being done, what we can do about it, and to simply then have clear priorities and less chaos. And truly, nobody wants more chaos and less clear priorities. So what I'm saying here is, if you're able to have this clear cut picture as to why such, internal analysis or external analysis is being done, there should be no reason as to why someone should be so weirded out or simply feel analyzed. That's all.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And you're not looking at, like individual employee level data. You're really looking at group level data because culture exists as a group.
Correct. So if I may just add to this, it's, you can go into the individual. The whole point is that it is quite granular. We looking at 24 different behaviors, and the whole point is that you can segment it, right? So if you
Sure.
want to compare different teams, how they work, and the whole organization in itself. Um, the individual is simply, you know, you can access it, you can look at it. It's not to say I have a list of bad and good people. That's not the point. The point is, as I just said, is to have clear priorities and ensuring that everyone's aligned and have less chaos in the whole organization, I would say.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. Well, Simone, thank you. This has been a really fantastic conversation. If folks would like to get a hold of you or follow your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, thanks, Klint. It's been a pleasure. Likewise, I try to be very active on LinkedIn, so I would say LinkedIn is a good platform to do that. I'd also be very happy with anyone that connects to dive more into depth on the technology side, how that works and how things get done. And other than that, the platform itself is humanaq.com. So I've tried to make a cultural playbook as well. That's in the works, and very happy to share that in the future as well.
Well, awesome. Well, by the time this episode comes out, that might be done. So, what we'll do is we will link to all of those resources in the show notes. And if the cultural playbook is available, we'll make sure we put that in there as well. Simone, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Klint. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Master Your Merger, hosted by Klint Kendrick. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found this valuable, share it with someone leading through a deal. To explore toolkits, resources, and upcoming programs, including our free roundtables, visit masteryourmerger.com. We'll see you next time.